He is mostly remembered for one feat. This sits above all others in the annals of mountaineering. An ageless, a top 10 adventure story for young and old. A humble man who let his deeds be his testament. Remains the most famous New Zealander ever, a title he is unlikely to ever lose, unless, of course, a New Zealand astronaut is on the first manned mission to Mars. Speaking of which, Neil Armstrong, the first man to land on the moon, piloted Edmund Hillary to the North Pole in 1985 in a twin-engined ski plane. Rather interestingly, on that flight was billionaire adventurer Steve Fossett. The moment Hillary exited that plane, he became the first man to have been on the top of the tallest mountain and to both poles. Even if you stripped Hillary's vast mountaineering exploits off his CV, we'd still be left with heaps of adventures he got up to in his 88 years, all of which live in the shadow of the mighty oak tree called Everest. One of these I've already touched on already at the top of the planet. One of those other ones is the main feature here. Let's go over some more. Get into the swing of things. And when I mean some, I mean just that. It's far from complete. Hillary went close to dying in World War II. He was the navigator in a Catalina flying boat of the No. 5 Squadron RNZAF, patrolling the waters around Fiji and the Solomon Islands in 1945. When his plane crashed, he was lucky to escape just burns. Went oh so close to becoming a victim in the Air New Zealand Erebus disaster, where 257 crew and passengers flew into Mount Erebus, Ross Island, Antarctica. These were day sightseeing trips operating ex-Auckland. The DC-10 would travel over the South Pole low enough for passengers to experience the continent, refuel at Christchurch and end back at Auckland. With his vast experience on the ice, Hillary had been a regular guest commentator/guide. He had to cancel his rostered flight down on the 28th of April 1979 due to a family function. His old mountaineering buddy, Peter Mulgrew, was roped in to do the commentary on board NZ 901. You'll hear about Mulgrew more later. Mulgrew's widow, June, would go on to marry Hillary in 1989. Hillary's life had been similarly blighted by an aircraft accident tragedy when in 1975 his first wife Louise and 16-year-old daughter Belinda were killed in an aircraft departing Kathmandu, Nepal. I mentioned at the beginning Hillary's humble nature. Here's a fine example. After having braved Mount Everest, he returned to New Zealand as a hero, a man's man, yet he couldn't build up the gumption to propose to Louise face to face, and so he used an intermediary, the soon-to-be mother-in-law. 1977, less than 2 years after the tragic loss of his wife and daughter, Ed Hillary led a party of 17 in 3 jet boats 2,500 kilometres up the Ganges to try and find the source from the sea. There's a really great low-budget documentary on YouTube about all of this. It's called Oceans to the Sky. I won't spoil what happens to the team. Allow you to watch the doco to find out yourself. It is on YouTube, as I've said. Search Ocean to the Sky 1977 or Ocean to the Sky Hillary. This gives one an idea of the scope of Hillary's adventures, and gentle reminders. They didn't all revolve around crampons and ropes, were, nevertheless, all dwarfed by Everest. Another of the forgotten expeditions was the Himalayan Scientific and Mountaineering Expedition, better now known as Silver Heart, 1960 to 61. The two behind Silver Heart and got the ball rolling were Hillary and British doctor Griffith Pugh. Pugh is a forgotten member of the 1953 British expedition that first ascended Everest, not ratcheting up the snowy face, rather as a backroom doctor monitoring the effects of altitude, cold, all that sort of thing. Hillary and Pugh pondered if it was possible for humans to climb tall mountains without oxygen by adaptation, living at high altitude for months at a time, doing the terrestrial version of what divers do to avoid the bends, acclimatise, and then go higher. They would plonk a team of scientists, doctors and mountaineers 5,800 metres up a remote Nepalese mountain, monitor their vitals, and then launch an attempt to summit the neighbouring Mount Makalu. That's roughly 3,000 metres higher. Makalu being the 5th highest mountain on the planet, measured from sea level. Technically, Mauna Kea in Hawaii is way taller than Everest. Previously, in 1954, Hillary had almost died climbing Mount Makalu, suffering a cerebral and pulmonary edema. This was one, in his words, he wanted to knock off. This project required not only an able team of experts happy to spend months at a time in isolation way up in a remote mountain in one of the most remotest parts of the earth, that required bundles of dosh. This they didn't have, nor was there a lot of public buy-in for a scientific expedition that spent most of the time playing cards and reading books. Gave all the appearances of a vanity project for elite mountaineers. They needed another hook to attract sponsorship. What better man to go out and seek funding than one of the most famous humans on the planet at that time, Sir Ed. In parallel to testing the physiological effects of altitude, they would go out Yeti hunting as well. Bingo! At one of the speaking engagements in the United States was John Dinehart of World Books, publishers of encyclopedias. He was gripped by the abominable snowman hunt, and lucky for Hillary, Pugh and crew, so was his company. So as far as they were concerned, do your Himalayan Scientific and Mountaineering Expedition business, stuff your low-oxygen human environmental tests, and just give our readership the exclusive on the Yeti. The project now had liftoff. For 10 months between 1960 and 61, a select team would be living their lives in a 6x3 metre prefabricated silver hut halfway up the mountain. Do a groundbreaking study on living in low oxygen environment, make an attempt to climb the neighbouring mountain unaided, and confirm or deny the existence of Yeti. Interest in America re-Yeti poaching wasn't just confined to an encyclopedia publisher. A zoologist, Malin Perkins, from the Lincoln Park Zoo in Chicago, would join the crew. Perkins was a bit of a national celeb, having his own nature TV program. This also helped lift the expedition's profile. He came armed with trip cameras, camouflage viewing dugouts, and being a rooting, tooting American, a gun as well. Not one to kill the beast, it was a tranquilizing dart gun. This not being the first time nosy Westerners had gone up into the mountains looking for hairy beasts. In 1953, the Daily Mirror magazine spent about $1.5 million in modern moolah launching their own failed private search. In light of all of this interest, the Nepalese government had a specific permit for Yeti hunts, stipulating the animals could only be killed in self-defence. Fearing a cornered Yeti was a dangerous one, the team also packed tear gas pistols. Perkins' plan was to transport the snowman to US, display it at the Chicago Zoo, and get the exclusive for his TV network. Whilst on CVs, let's look at who else was involved with his distinctly Kiwi-Brit adventure. George Lowe, New Zealand climbing royalty, veteran of the 1951 New Zealand run at the Himalayas. On the back of that, Lowe and Hillary got to go on the British expedition 2 years later. Lowe did a lot of the grunt work, helping Tenzing and Hillary to get to the top. One of the most well-known Hillary quotes is, "We knocked the bastard off." This is an abbreviated version of what Hillary said when he got down to the closest camp below. The full quote is, "Well, George, we knocked the bastard off." That George is George Lowe. Norm Hardy, more NZ climbing royalty and a good mate of Hillary's from their search and rescue days. Hardy would go on to be on the team to summit the third highest mountain in the world, Kangchenjunga, in 1954. Technically, that was a harder climb than Everest. As many of you know, there are log jams of people, 40 groups at a time, going up and down Everest in any one day. To emphasise the commercial nature of Everest today, climbing the highest peak, one of the guides from New Zealand, a guide from Queenstown specifically, Mark Woodward, he has got to the top 10 times. That's miles behind the top local Sherpa, Orama Riti. He's made it up 29 times. Before I get on to the other two I'm going to profile, later this year I'm going to do a trek in Tibet. Base camp is on my itinerary. Next up, Peter Mulgrew. I've touched base on him before. He'll be front and centre in this one. Without spilling the beans too much, post this expedition he wasn't going to be playing football. He got the hard word from the wife, it's me or those mountains. Michael Ward, British surgeon Michael Ward, he was another veteran of the 1953 Everest team, which was massive, by the way, 350, mostly Sherpas doing the heavy lifting for just 10 climbers. Ward pioneered the fledgling use of mapping mountains from above to deduce the best route to the top. In the days before satellite, he used RAF snaps. No framework can be complete without mentioning logistics. Remember, this was a 10-month project. Ningbo is right hard up against China. The communist government were suspicious of what was going on, and they sent spies to infiltrate the local community to see what was up, believing this was just a thinly veiled attempt by nasty capitalists to monitor their nuclear tests. Back to the location. "50 miles from Everest base, as the Himalayan griffin flies, or glides, 150 kilometres from Kathmandu. Only the road ends 15 kilometres from the bottom of the mountain, come glacier in question, near the small village of Bedding. If you want to transport yourself to another world, put Bedding, Beding, into Google or YouTube's search bar. Then from that point everything would need to be hauled by pack animals like yaks to the site. Then Sherpas up the mountain. 350 Sherpa were needed to undertake the grunt work. Close by to the expedition base, at 4,600 metres, was a small landing strip built to ferry people back and forward to Kathmandu, and for emergency purposes it would see action in that last capacity. In chronological terms, the scientific phase took place in isolation over winter, in which 10 people spent their time in drinking tea and reading books inside the Silver Hut or nearby tent, getting tested daily for physiological changes. They had hauled up a primitive exocycle to test VO2 max, beats per minute, and this first phase took place November 1960 till March 61. Hillary wasn't there for that. He turned up when the snows had receded, conditions became more climbable, skiable and huntable. Skipping forward to when it became possible to go on Yeti hunts and undertake climbs. Somewhat unscripted, the climbing team decided to have a practice crack at a closer mountain, Mount Ama Dablan, at the beginning of March. When the Nepalese authorities got wind of this unauthorised climb, they went native, put a stop to that little number. All efforts went back to Makalu in April. Seven camps were established up the mountain. 3 of those, 1, 3 and 5, had one of those exocycle thingies to test the climbers, remembering they were all trying to make that climb without assistance. 3 teams of 2 would go up separately and their physiological conditions monitored and compared with the lower camp. How did they go? Were they able to summit? Can be answered in a 2-letter word beginning with N. The second major part of the expedition was a bit of a disappointment. verging on disaster. Make that deadly disaster. Hillary, one of the climbers not having spent the winter up the mountain, he made it to Camp 4, knew he was fading and retreated back down to Camp 2. At 42 years, this was to be his last time he would do any serious climbing. Not that the other climbers who had acclimatised fared much better. They too found the going hard in what was appalling conditions. The first official team made it to Camp 6, and then they pulled the plug. The second pair feared the worst, had only just left Camp 6 and got into real difficulty. Came oh so close to dying. It took the Sherpas 5 days to get them off the mountain. One of those was Peter Mulgrew. He had a pulmonary edema and suffered severe frostbite, meaning his feet had to be amputated. It was when his wife flew from New Zealand and visited her half-dead husband in Kathmandu Hospital.
Stop this lie.
For the record, he obliged. There was a plan to send 3 groups of climbers up Makalu, but after these near-death experiences, the ceaseless crap weather, further attempts were canned. One side of the Silver Hut had gone to plan, the other not so well. What about the third and most interesting part? Traipsing around the mountain they did, looking for signs of abominable snowmen. Not just Hillary and Perkins. At some point, every one of the 21 scientists and climbers had a go at staring through telescopes, manning large cameras, tramping around looking for Yeti poop. Zip. All was not lost. In the surrounding villages, there were 3 monasteries said to possess bits and pieces of Yeti. The most significant of those being the remnants of skulls. Using his status and promises his charity would do something specifically for their neck of the woods, governmental toing and throwing, Sir Ed got permission to take 1 skull off for testing. On his tour were labs in Paris, London and Chicago. Picture him now at customs.
Anything to declare, sir?
Yeah, just this Yeti skull, mate. I should also mention other relics did the tour, including a mummified human hand. All of this was gold for the backers of the expedition. It gripped the world. What was the wash-up? Let me summarise the Yeti tests by reading out the headlines and blurbs from the New Zealand newspapers mid-1961.
Hillary concedes that the Yeti, mythical beast.
It has been learnt this week or 2 that the scalp is not genuine. Existence of Yeti denied by scientist. Hillary back in time. That last headline indicates Hillary was good to his word, returned the scalp and other preciouses back to their owners as scheduled. All this Himalayan stuff has really got me looking forward to visiting this spectacular region later in the year. I'm not packing any large nets on my trek, nor for that matter precautionary Yeti scarers and tear gas pistol. I'm always happy to hear from listeners, especially nice ones who like, subscribe and listen regularly. Remember to watch that documentary, Mountains to the Sea, 1977, and take a look at the village of Bedding, Beding. Also, on that subject of taking a look or listen, why not take a look at or listen at my earlier stuff? That would be a really good idea as well. Spot you next time. Bye for now.